Doom. The Dark Ages wants to be more like the original Doom. Martin compared revisiting the original Doom to a painter going to a museum to study a Norman Rockwell painting. It's like a classic piece of art, said Martin. It's like a painter going to a museum and studying the Norman Rockwell painting he's already studied 50 times. Every time you look at it, you learn something new. In figuring out how to resimplify the modern Doom formula, ID Software creative designer Hugo Martin said he found himself going back to the 90s Doom games for inspiration more than any others. The original Doom, and why it has stood the test of time, is it's one of the most accessible FPS single-player campaigns ever made, he said. When it comes to combat, it's really incredibly streamlined, and that's why it's fun to this day. Doom. The Dark Ages will place more of an emphasis on a horizontal battlefield when compared to Doom Eternal's verticality. This is another area where Doom. The Dark Ages takes inspiration from Doom, since the original shooter didn't really have the capacity to feature three-dimensional levels. Enemies and players were on the same 2D plane, and as such, gameplay was less about twitch reflex-based aiming. In Eternal, there's a lot of activity along the vertical y-axis, Martin said, but here it felt better to focus the threats and the targets along the horizon line. It's a movement shooter still, but the movement is more about what's happening along the x-axis. The idea, Martin said, is for the controls to feel intuitive enough that when we pressure the player, they're not reaching for buttons they're not familiar with. But making the controls simpler doesn't make the game easier overall, he said. On the contrary, Martin argued that when you streamline your control scheme, you can actually make things harder. Some people said Doom Eternal was too hard, Martin continued. I think it was too complex. The complexity of the control scheme led to unnecessary difficulties. You want to be fighting the demons, not the controls. According to Martin, some of the weapons in the game were seemingly inspired by classical torture devices. Part of the reason we chose the fantasy genre is that we could get more dark and sinister with a toolkit, said Martin. When you think medieval, dark fantasy, you think torture devices, ropes, chains, and spikes. The developers said they want the Dark Ages to recapture the feeling from the original Doom of being an easy game to get into, harder to master, really accessible but very challenging. Narrowing the control options helps lead to a game that feels more like classic Doom than any game we've made up to this point, Martin said. Martin did confirm, however, that the size of the game's levels fall into the sweet spot of taking most players around an hour to finish. This was done in an effort to maintain good pacing for the upcoming shooter. I don't know that you want to play a single Doom level for 2 hours, he said. You want them to be nice, contained experiences, so around an hour is about the sweet spot. But if you're a completionist, you could certainly extend that. Doom. The Dark Ages is coming to PC, PS5, and Xbox Series X/S.